So just I had a conversation with Murray Monroe about accents. He's done a lot of work on accents in Canada, and he put me in touch with somebody by the name of Harris, done some classic work on accents, and who notes that under such circumstances, children bring with them to adulthood the language and accent of their peers, not those of their parents. Evidence comes from studies of hearing children reared by deaf parents and of deaf children reared by hearing parents, and from studies of the children of immigrants. So for me, the question then looks at language from a very different perspective, which is, in a sense, the influence of the peer group. And as McDermott says, language and culture are no longer scripts to be acquired as much as they are conversations in which people can participate. The question of who is learning what and how much is essentially a question of what conversations they are part of. And this question is a subset of the more powerful question of what conversations are around to be had in a given culture. So that kind of sets the tone for my presentation. So I'm going to be looking at some central questions and drawing on some studies. People have said, where is the data? And I've got some very interesting data that looks at not only adults, that was some of my earlier work, but also looking at young language learners, middle school and secondary school learners as well, for these perspectives on education and also their relevance, I think, for the Arizona debate. So my questions are, under what conditions do English language learners speak, read and write English? To what extent can research provide insight into English language learning? And what are the implications for ESL teachers? So just looking again at the question of fluency, and we've been talking quite a bit about fluency today, and I'm going back to the work of Bernard Spolsky, who says the more time spent learning any aspect of a language, the more will be learned. Learning a language involves the opportunity for the new skills to be practiced, and the result is fluency. So this is not rocket science, but it is a reminder that we do need to use the language in order to gain fluency. But the question is, under what conditions will language learners speak? And in particular, of course, speaking with the peer group, because it's the peer group that is really going to give them access and opportunity to learn the native language. And how are opportunities to speak socially structured? And it's, as you've probably heard me say at this conference again, I'm very interested in questions of power and how is power implicated. So in fact, when I think about kind of theories of language and learning, although we were all brought up on, for example, the work of Del Hymes, and we know that it's important to understand the rules of use of a language, I'm particularly inspired by the work of Pierre Bourdieu, because he talks about the right to speech, who has the right to speech. But even more importantly, and this really links very closely with the issues that we were talking about this morning, who has the power to impose reception? Who can get up and speak, and not only speak, but also be heard? Who has the power to impose reception on the speakers? And I was just very interested. I am not a Southern European male, good-looking, handsome. So, I've got to do the best I can, So, but I did find that quite interesting, that what a great speaker that was. So, the whole point is who has the power to impose reception. And what Bourdieu argues is that a lot of linguistic theory has been built on the assumption that those who speak regard those who listen as worthy to listen, and those who listen regard those who speak as worthy to speak. And that is not something we can take for granted. So if we just have a look at some of this, is going back to some of my earlier work, and I will be bringing you up to some of my more recent work, but it is useful just to have a look at the challenges that children experience in school are also experienced by adults in many different contexts. And as Eva said in one of my earlier studies, everybody working with me is Canadian. When I started to work there, they couldn't understand that it might be difficult for me to understand everything and know about everything, what it's normal for them. To explain it more clearly, I can write an example which happened a few days ago. The girl which is working with me pointed at the man and said, "Do you see him?" I said, "Yes, why? Don't you know him?" "No, I don't know him." "How come you don't know him?" "Don't you watch TV? That's Bart Simpson." Because the person with Bart Simpson t-shirt. And this is the crucial point. It made me feel so bad, and I didn't answer her nothing. Until now, I don't know why this person was important. So just looking here at this workplace context, the person who opens the conversation here is the native speaker, who is called her Gail. and the person who closes the conversation is the native speaker. And interesting, just if you have a look at this from a discourse perspective, you'll see when the native speaker first asks a question, do you know him? Yes, why? Don't you know him? It's almost like an accusation rather than a question. And then, how come you don't know him? We've even dropped the question mark, right? It becomes, in a sense, an accusation. Don't you watch TV? Again, no, an accusation rather than a question. And even then, the answer is provided. So in fact, what happens is that this is not, in a sense, in any way, an authentic conversation. It gets opened, it gets closed by the native speaker. So in fact, Bourdieu would argue that this is an example of illegitimate discourse. It's not a simple communication breakdown, because he would argue that Gail is a legitimate speaker, as the native speaker, the knower of the language, and Eva is the illegitimate receiver of the utterance. She is not an appropriate receiver of that utterance. She is an imposter, you know, in Bourdieu's terms. So, and she is an immigrant woman. So if we look, in fact, I said to Eva, so why didn't you just ask her who was Bart Simpson? And she said, and she saw herself through the eyes of her interlocutor. And she said, you don't watch TV? And I felt, what are you doing? I was thinking, like, this strange woman. So she saw herself as her interlocutor saw her, and she took on that identity of the strange woman. And of course, this does change. For example, a male customer said to her, are you putting on this accent so that you can get more tips? At which point Eva said, I wish I did not have this accent, because then I would not have to listen to such comments. So it is quite interesting that, you know, she does get to a point in her growth where she does resist being positioned as strange. But interesting enough, she still says, I wish I did not have this accent.